Hello, Petal. How are you doing? How are things? How's life? It's been a crazy week over here at the Cat Flap. How are things over your way? A quick recap in that Don is having a slight existential crisis by having a little bit of an argument with whether magic really exists and if it's useful or not, and having a conversation with himself, his past self, in the form of a photograph, hopefully able to translate a book for him. I don't know about you, I'd be slightly irked. Maybe irked is not quite the right word. Discombobulated, I like that word. That's a ridiculous word, but I quite like it. But that's still not right. They're not the right word. Unsettled. Unsettled, yes. I'll go with unsettled. In the grand tradition of understatement, I shall go with unsettled. Like with any other circumstance in a Tom Holt book, but I think we're getting quite accustomed to them by now. So, this is going to be Chapter 6 of Life, Liberty and the Pursuit of Sausages, J.W. Wells and Co. Book 7. As ever, if you could be so kind as to like the chapter if you enjoy it. If you haven't yet, please subscribe. It really helps the channel. And if you want to share and hit the notifications bell, that's absolutely perfect. But of course, always your choice. I'm glad that you're here. Let's get cracking then. Chapter 6. Lack of sleep, more than anything else, finally made his mind up for him. Mr. Huos had always slept soundly, 9 hours a night for as long as he could remember, from 9 p.m. to 6 a.m, out like a light, a selection from his extensive repertoire of strange and disturbing recurring dreams, then instantly wide awake without the need of an alarm. Insomnia was a new one on him, and he really did not like it, not even for one night. So he decided, yes, I suppose I'll have to. At 9 sharp he made a call. At 9:35 reception buzzed him to let him know Mr. Goggerty was here to see him. Mr. Horse closed his eyes. Show him in. He'd only ever spoken to Stan Goggerty on the phone, so all his assumptions were based on the voice. He'd been expecting a short man, probably rotund, quite possibly bald and with thick glasses. He was, therefore, mildly disconcerted when reception ushered in 7 feet of lean muscle. He'd been right about bald, but only because Mr. Goggerty shaved his head. Stan, he said, thanks for coming round so quickly. No bother. Mr. Goggerty folded his tremendous limbs and sat down. What's the problem? For a moment, Mr. Huos felt sure he wouldn't be able to go through with it after all. To his surprise, he found he was stronger than that. Or just plain desperate. I need you to find something for me. Mr. Goggerty nodded. That's what I do, he said. What am I looking for? Mr. Huos smiled. I don't know. All right. What sort of thing? Mr. Huos shrugged. That's it, he said. I don't know. It could be anything. Thimble, 12mm wing nut, bottle top, belt buckle, doorknob. There's a fair chance it's either brass or gold, but I can't guarantee that. I've got no idea how it might react to somebody else, you see. He paused, then said, You think I've gone mad, don't you? Not the slightest flicker of emotion on Mr. Goggerty's face. Not necessarily, he said. Besides, several of my best clients are mad, absolutely barking. But if they want something found and they can afford to pay... Mr. Huos got up and crossed to the window. Fantastic view from up here. You could see for miles. Ironic, really. Stan, he said, I'm going to tell you something I've never told anybody before. Discretion. Of course. Fine. His neck was itching. He loosened his tie, undid his top button, ran a finger around inside his collar. Not sure where to start, to be honest with you. All right, let's try this. How long have we known each other? Mr. Goggerty thought for a moment. 5 years, isn't it? Something like that. Mr. Hwoss turned away from the window, caught sight of the Ordnance Survey map on his desk, and winced. I call you Stan, but you don't know my first name. Well, do you? No. Mr. Hwoss nodded. Neither do I, he said. In fact, I've got no reason to suppose I've even got one. You've no idea what a nuisance. I mean, take signatures. I do a sort of doctor's squiggle. I've been told that some of my business rivals hired the world's leading handwriting expert to study my signature, try and find out from it what makes me tick. I haven't got a clue what conclusion he came to, but it's bound to be way off beam. I do the squiggle because I haven't got any bloody initials, simple as that. Mr. Goggerty was frowning, ever so slightly, but that was enough. You mean you've forgotten? Maybe. Mr. Hwoss shrugged. Maybe there wasn't ever anything to forget. Do you know the first thing I can remember? My earliest memory? No, of course you don't. Stupid question. He sighed, took a deep breath. My earliest memory is looking at myself in a full-length mirror in the lobby of a 2-star hotel in Skinval. That's a city in Georgia, in the foothills of the Caucasus Mountains. I was wearing a rather dusty light grey suit with a pale blue shirt and a blue and green striped tie, plain brown shoes, and odd socks. I had $100,000 in large denomination notes stuffed in my trouser pockets, a galvanized steel earring in each ear, a small brass ring in my shirt pocket, and horse written on the back of my left hand in blue felt-tip marker. That was 10 years ago. Mr. Goggerty's fears hadn't moved, except for his eyes. They were quite round. Oh, he said. Mr. Hwoss nodded. I went to the reception desk. I knew I was in a hotel and what a hotel was, and I had the presence of mind to ask for my key. The clerk gave me one and said the abbot had called while I was out. Luckily, there was a number for me to call. I could understand the desk clerk perfectly. I can understand any language in the world, by the way. I don't hear any difference. Chinese, Polish, Congolese, Tamil, to me it's just someone talking. I could understand the numbers on the bit of paper the clerk gave me. What I mean is, I knew what the figure 7 stood for and so forth, but writing was just squiggles. It took me a year to learn how to read. Mr. Hwoss paused for a while, as though he'd just carried a heavy weight up a long flight of stairs. Anyway, he continued, I went up to the room. No luggage, nothing at all that belonged to me. I called the number, asked to speak to the abbot. Nice man, he added, very sympathetic. Apparently he ran a very old, very small monastery way up in the mountains, Russian Orthodox. Always had a soft spot for them because of that. They found me on a mountain top way up high, 20 kilometres from the nearest road. You could only get there on foot. You couldn't even get a helicopter in there, but the soles of my shoes were hardly scuffed at all. At that, Mr. Goggerty lifted his head a whole inch. The abbot said I was out cold, Mr. Hwoss went on. Not ill or anything, which was odd, because if I'd been there more than an hour, I ought to have been suffering from exposure, hypothermia, something of the sort, just fast asleep. The monks carried me down off the mountain. Really good, kind thing to do. Must have been a hell of a job. I've been back there since, of course, many times. Anyway, when I woke up, they said all I did for an hour was crouch in a corner making animal noises. Animal noises, Mr. Goggerty repeated. Quite. Woof, grunt, bark, snuffle, that sort of thing. The monks reckoned I was possessed by devils. Can't say I blame them, really. Anyhow, after about an hour of that, I went back to sleep, and when they checked up on me a bit later, I was sitting up in bed asking for acorns. They sent for a doctor, but
but there wasn't anyone who could come out to them, so they took me down into town in their donkey cart. I can't remember any of that. I guess they'd found the money in my pockets, so they booked me into the hotel, told the clerk I was American, and that,
Mr. Horse said, with a sigh that seemed to start in his socks and pick up momentum along the way,
is all I remember. The finest Harley Street specialists reckon I'm somewhere between 40 and 60 years old. Can't be more specific than that. Perfect health, except some of my internal organs are in very unusual places. They work just fine, though, so what the hell? And I've never had more than a cold since. I came to this country after I made my first $1 million. Dollars, of course, not pounds. Since then, I haven't looked back. You can read all about it in the financial papers.
He stopped, and Mr. Goggerty looked at him in silence for about 10 seconds. Then he said,
Acorns. So they told me. I'm sure they were telling the truth. Monks don't lie, in my experience. I offered to build them a new monastery the year before last, but they would not have it. They like the old one, they said. Wouldn't take any money, but they finally accepted a golf cart. Only sort of vehicle that can handle the terrain, he explained.
Mr. Goggerty nodded.
So, presumably you're Russian, he said. No idea. I don't feel Russian. Don't feel anything. I've got a Russian passport, of course. Cost me $1,000, and it's full of spelling mistakes. I keep it for sentimental reasons.
Mr. Horse grinned.
I should think this is where you say that was the weirdest story you've ever heard. No, actually, Mr. Goggerty replied. Far from it, in fact.
He rubbed his chin with his fingertips, then asked,
The earrings, you still got them? Of course. I've had a team of forensic scientists working on them for the past 2 years. Cost me $500,000. Result? They're galvanized steel earrings. Why? No inscription. Letters, numbers, completely plain.
Mr. Goggerty made a doesn't matter gesture with his hands.
And the other ring? Probably a curtain ring, but they didn't want to commit themselves. Worn?
Mr. Horse frowned.
Sorry. Was it worn down at all, like it had been rubbed hard against something? Mr. Horse was impressed. Slightly, he said, on one side. What made you ask that? Just a hunch, Mr. Goggerty said dismissively. And brass, you said? Yes. And that's what you've lost?
Mr. Goggerty steepled his fingers.
Yes. How did you?
Mr. Goggerty raised a hand for silence. Very polite, the way a bishop would have done it.
But you said it could be anything.
Mr. Horse sighed.
This is where it starts to get profoundly screwy, he said. It changes, turns into things. Yes.
Mr. Horse paused.
You don't seem...
A slow, thoughtful smile crept over Mr. Goggerty's face, changing it almost out of recognition.
When I said I worked for a lot of mad people, he said, I didn't mean to imply I don't believe them. Except when I know they're lying, of course. It turns into things. Yes,
Mr. Horse nodded vigorously.
In fact, I only know it's really the brass ring because I've always kept it in a little box. You know, a jewellery box with a catch you press to open it. I know it couldn't have got out of there. Nothing else could have got in. But when I open it, well, pot luck, you might say. No idea what I'm going to find in there. As long as it's brass or gold and fits in the box, it can be any damn thing.
Mr. Goggerty looked down at his hands.
Sooner or later, he said, one of us is going to have to use the M word. I'd rather we didn't. As you wish. As we both know, though, it's that stuff, isn't it?
Mr. Horse said nothing and nodded.
Good, Mr. Goggerty said. That's that out of the way. Tell me, do you like apples? Love them. This business of not having a first name.
Mr. Goggerty's eyebrows twitched together.
I can see what a pain that must be. So why didn't you simply give yourself one? Make one up.
It was as though Mr. Quoss couldn't grasp the concept.
I couldn't do that, he said.
Because? Frown.
It wouldn't be right. I mean, it's not my place.
To give yourself a name, surely you've got every right.
Maybe it had never occurred to Mr. Quoss before to see it in that light.
I don't think so, he said. I wouldn't feel comfortable, like I was lying all the time, pretending to be someone I'm not.
Mr. Gockety frowned, but all he said was,
interesting.
It was one of his key words, and he practiced saying it in front of the mirror every night before going to bed. He knew 36 different inflections for the word interesting. On his lips, it was practically a language in itself. On this occasion, however, it didn't seem to have its usual sedative effect.
Well, Mr. Quoss barked.
Like I said, interesting.
Number 24.
Interesting. Now then, where do you last remember seeing it?
Mr. Quoss smiled, a rather grim, sinister circus clown sort of effort.
It was in its box, in the right outside pocket of my lightweight navy blue overcoat.
Mr. Gockety's left eyebrow twitched.
That's quite precise.
I remember it distinctly.
Excellent. Any idea when?
Mr. Quoss nodded.
About 5:15, day before yesterday. Before you ask, Asquith Street.
That's just off Clevedon Road, isn't it?
That's right. I remember it clearly because I made a mental note not to forget to take it out of my pocket before I took the coat in to be cleaned.
But you forgot.
Mr. Quoss looked puzzled for a moment.
That's right, he said. Bloody odd, actually. All the years I've had the thing, I've developed a sort of sixth sense about it. No matter where I am or what I'm doing, I always know at the back of my mind exactly where it is. Sort of like a mum and her toddler, I suppose you could say.
Well, you would,
Mr. Gockety said,
since it's clearly very important to you. I'm like that with my car keys.
Mr. Quoss shook his head.
No, you're not, he said. No offence, but there's no comparison. You may be careful with stuff. I spend a huge proportion of my life making sure I know where that box is. It's no exaggeration to say it's an obsession.
But not this time,
Mr. Gockety prompted him.
That's the weird thing,
Mr. Quoss replied with a sigh.
I left the bloody thing in my coat pocket. I simply can't account for it.
All right,
Mr. Gockety shrugged gracefully.
Be that as it may, he said, I can't see there's much of a problem. If it was in your pocket when you took the coat in, then presumably it's still there, in the coat, at the cleaner's.
Mr. Quoss's creepy smile burst out again.
Quite possibly, he said, but that's fuck all help to me.
Why?
The cleaner's gone.
Ah.
For a fraction of a second, Mr. Quoss flattered himself that he might finally have faced Stan Gockety. No way of proving it, of course.
Gone as in?
Not there any more. And that's not all. I asked, and the woman in the shop where it used to be reckoned there had never been a cleaner's there.
Well, in the depths of Mr. Gockety's Horvis-brown eyes, a tiny spurt of light flickered. Then the ARP warden of self-control made him put it out, and he nodded.
And wherever it's gone, it's taken your coat with it.
I couldn't give a stuff about the coat.
Well, of course not.
Perish the thought, added the line of Mr. Gockety's jaw.
You don't happen to remember the name?
Mr. Quoss took a little green ticket from his shirt pocket and handed it over. Mr. Gockety reached for it, checked himself, took a pair of dentist's forceps from inside his jacket, and used them to lower the ticket carefully into a little clear plastic bag, which he then sealed before putting it away.
Thank you, he said. That could be very important, but you didn't answer my question. The name over the door.
I don't know,
Mr. Quoss said feebly.
Never occurred to me to look. I've only ever thought of it as the dry cleaners in Clevedon Road. Just human nature.
Mr. Gockety smiled primly.
That's assuming you're human, he said. I can't afford to make presumptions like
Not human?
Mr. Hors's eyes were large, perfect circles.
What in hell's that supposed to mean?
As soon as Mr. Horse raised his voice, it was as though some kind of shutter had come down over Mr. Gockety's face. That one-way glass they use for identity parades, maybe.
No offence, he said, but given what you've just told me about yourself, it's not something I can take for granted.
Mr. Horse was grappling with the implications of that, like a one-armed man assembling a flat-pack wardrobe.
So you're saying there's people out there who look human, but really...
Mr. Gockety nodded. And I'm glad you asked me that question, look.
You'd be surprised,
he said. Mr. Horse, serious expression.
No, I wouldn't.
Mr. Gockety, total lack of expression.
Yes, you would, but let's not get sidetracked. You're right, it is odd, you forgetting like that. Interesting.
He produced a little spiral-bound notebook. It had yellow roses on the cover.
Nothing else unusual, out of the ordinary?
Nothing that springs to mind.
Mr. Gockety found that interesting too, but he knew better than to say so.
Well,
he said,
you've given me plenty to go on.
I have?
Oh yes, several promising leads.
He paused, clearly considering something.
Mind if I ask you a personal question?
Fire away.
Mr. Gockety took a moment to choose his words.
Would you call yourself a tidy person? Fastidious in manners of cleanliness, that sort of thing?
I guess so,
Mr. Horse replied. Then he added,
Very much so, actually. In fact, that's probably the main reason my wife left me.
Really?
Mr. Horse pulled a sad face.
She had a problem with me washing up the pots and pans before we'd actually eaten the meal, he said, and colour-coding her wardrobe.
Excuse me?
Shrug.
I'd go through her clothes, putting them in colour order, all the blues and the greens and the yellows.
Ah,
Mr. Gockety said.
In rainbow order,
Mr. Horse went on.
You know, the order in which they appear in the spectrum.
And she didn't like that.
Another shrug.
Made perfect sense to me,
Mr. Horse said.
After all, that's the order colours are supposed to be in nature.
Mr. Gockety looked at him for a moment, then wrote something in his notebook.
Married long?
6 weeks.
Anyway, Mr. Gockety stood up. As soon as I've got anything, I'll let you know.
Thanks.
Mr. Horse was looking past him, at the wall.
If you can hurry it along, I'd be very grateful.
It's my top priority,
Mr. Gockety said. Out in the street, Mr. Gockety found a substantial-looking lamp-post and leaned against it while he pulled himself together. He'd had to put in an enormous amount of effort to keep his professional cool during the interview. Now his legs felt weak and his brain was seething like a saucepan of pasta full of strange shapes moving at random. 15 years in the trade, and he'd never heard the like, never from a client, not from his college tutors, not even after closing time at the 666 Club, when the old-timers, like Ricky Wormtoter and Kurt Lundqvist, used to huddle in the darkened back room over a bottle of triple distilled kvass and tell the stories they never told anywhere else, but they were all dead now, or gone to strange, dark places even he didn't like to think about. And there was no one left he could ask. Not about something like this. Mr. Horse liked apples. Prizing himself off the lamppost, he straightened his back, fished out his mobile, and fired off a terse text message to the Regius Professor of Ancient Greek at Oxford, who owed him a favour. Circumstantial evidence, even if his memory was correct. But there was so much of it. Acorns, signs of wear on one side only of a plain brass ring. Galvanized steel, no numbers, but Schleiman and Chang in the 1976 paper for the Nairobi conference had postulated that data would inevitably be lost in the metapsychotic flux inversion. If he was right. He put his phone carefully back in his pocket.
I am not an academic, he reminded himself. I'm a practitioner, which means I carry out the instructions of my clients.
His mission was to find a misplaced object, nothing more. It was an inviolable rule of the profession, no conducting pure research into the customers without their express permission, which in this case might be forthcoming, but then again it might not. He could always ask, he supposed, but a refusal would probably bring with it a cancellation of his retainer, and Mr. Horse paid oh so very well. A taxi went by, its yellow light off, but no passenger inside. Mr. Gockety frowned. The taxi slowed to a halt and reversed, annoying a great many road users in the process, until its passenger door was level with Mr. Gockety's outstretched hand. By the time it got there, its for-hire light was glowing.
"Where to?"
the driver asked in a mildly bewildered voice. Mr. Gockety gave him the address, and the taxi moved off. For the first 5 minutes of the ride, Mr. Gockety sat perfectly still and quiet. Then he took his phone out again and used it to access the net. The other net, the one that was old when Merlin was resitting S-level geomancy. He called up the text of Schleiman and Chang, read it twice, and then switched off.
Yes, he said to himself, but this case is different. I don't think I'll be able to do the job I'm being paid for unless I find out at least a few basic facts about Mr. Horse's interesting past. And if that means a bit of pure research along the way, then so be it. And if I don't, I'll have to call him up and say I'm sorry, but I haven't got a clue how to proceed. No clues, no leads, it could be anywhere.
True. Strictly speaking, he ought to explain all that to the client before he went poking about in the obscurities of his backstory, but he knew Mr. Horse pretty well by now. A busy man wouldn't want to be bothered with details every 5 minutes. Oddly enough, the traffic lights were green all the way, so it wasn't long before Mr. Gockety reached his destination. As he barged through the revolving door and crossed the marble-tiled lobby to the security desk, he thought,
one little paper can't do anybody any harm. After all, only the trade'll ever read it, and we're broad-minded, God knows. Yes, he added, as the guard checked his security pass, but our corporate morality doesn't really bear inspection, and we tend to have about as many scruples as a bomb. Also, we're quite fond of money, and blackmail could be a lucrative sideline.
The 5th floor of the building, it has no number, but the postman seemed to be able to find it all right, houses the Paul Carpenter Memorial Library. Founded by his enemies to commemorate the centenary of one of the trade's most eminent practitioners. Founded before he was born, as it happened. That was a story that cropped up in exam questions nearly every year. The Carpenter Library's collection encompassed every aspect of the profession, both applied and theoretical. It was Mr. Gockety's spiritual home, the place he'd dreamed of seeing ever since he'd first heard of it as a boy growing up in the back streets of Port of Spain. Now he came here most days, used it as an office, a resource, a washroom and cafeteria, occasionally as a hotel room, but the thrill that went with pushing open the great bronze-faced cedar doors and walking into the main reading room was still as electric as ever. It was where Mr. Gockety sincerely hoped he'd go when he died, assuming he'd been very, very good. He knew exactly where to look for what he needed. Most of the carpenter's books were still paper, usually with leather or vellum bindings, for insulation. Attempts to store them on microfiche or digitally tended to result in an explosion and a shower of sparks visible from planetary orbit. Van Spee and Vesvanus Manual of Transdimensional Displacement, the 1831 edition, with the addenda and the charming period illustrations, was still the standard work and one of Mr. Gogarty's favourite reads. There was only one copy in existence, in this reality at least, and here he was taking it down from the shelf, blowing off the dust as though breathing into his lover's ear, opening it at the index.
If you have enjoyed this book...
No, gone too far. He turned back a few pages and ran his finger down the near side column until he came to Jacksonville, Georgia. He found the entry, which was short and very much to the point. Then he closed the book and laid it down carefully on the desk in front of him. It was possible then. The thought both elated and chilled him. Dragonov's experiments in 1803 had achieved a really quite similar result, albeit in reverse, but there had to be a cause, rephrase that, shorn of teleological implications. There had to have been an originating event, whether deliberate or accidental. Figure that out. He shook his head. That'd be like trying to find the end of a circle. If you had the event, you could trace the consequences as Dragonov had done. Piece of cake, A-level stuff, and in any case, outside of a classroom, why would you ever want to? But the other way round? He tried to find an appropriate visual image. All right, what about a bottle? A great big bottle with a narrow neck and mouth. Fine. Pouring water out of the bottle. Easy. Pouring the water back in again. Blindfolded, particularly if you don't happen to have a funnel. Nice, but in the end, unhelpful. Far more to it than that. Dragonov himself had tried it in 1804, and they flooded the resulting crater and used it for yacht races. Frustrating. He leaned back in his chair, eyes closed, drawing on the library like a battery. What did that mean in practical terms, as far as finding Mr. Quartz's missing ring was concerned? Well, it meant he had no starting point, because he couldn't ascertain where the ring had come from in the first place, and without that, he could only make an educated guess as to what it actually did. No matter, if he couldn't solve the puzzle by starting at the beginning, the next logical place to try was at the end, which, in this case... The really disturbing thing, of course, was that no matter what they do to it, the chemicals they pump in, the filtration systems they install, the water of Dragonov's lake resolutely stays white. Meant the sight of a vanished dry cleaners in, where was it again? Clevedon Road, where, if he was lucky, he might be able to pick up traces of coherent subatomic resonances, which might just possibly allow him to extrapolate where the dry cleaners was now. Or he could look in the yellow pages. The thought made him grin. Strange things had happened, and Schliemann and Chang had speculated, in a footnote deleted from all printed copies of their work, except the Dutch Book Club edition, about what happened to all the data that got wiped in transfer. Information, they'd argued, cannot simply disappear, just as matter cannot just cease to exist. Instead, it turns into something else, or goes somewhere, just as burned wood becomes smoke and carbon. Admittedly, they went on to hypothesize that all the data lost when your hard drive crashes eventually drifts back like a volcanic ash in the form of spam emails, and that was presumably the point at which their editors, with the exception of the Dutch, had lost patience and started scrabbling for the blue pencil. Maybe, though, there was a nugget of truth poking out of the drivel. At any rate, it couldn't hurt to look. Besides, he admitted to himself, it'd be an excuse for a trip to the stack. Like most of the profession's libraries, the Carpenter had solved its storage problems by expanding into the useful, though rather disreputable, dimension known to the trade as Van Spee space, named after the megalomaniac genius who'd first encountered it. Neither parallel nor tangential Van Spee space bears roughly the same relation to the Einsteinian continuum as the personal injury lawyers who advertise on daytime TV bear to the mainstream legal profession. It's there. Lots of people use it, and nothing can be done about it right now, not for want of trying. But it's best not to harp on about it when talking to respectable scientists, for fear of causing offence. Properly engineered and installed, with all the appropriate safeguards in place, a Van Spee enclave allows a property owner to double, triple, quadruple his floor space regardless of location, with no disturbance or inconvenience to adjoining properties. The enclave can be accessed by a conventional door, and since the existence of Van Spee space isn't recognised under British law, it's not subject to council tax, planning law, building regulations, listed buildings approval, or environmental legislation. You can have a 1,000-acre country estate in your one-room flat, complete with skyscraper blocks, a rave venue, an artillery firing range and a nuclear power station, and nobody can stop you or charge you a penny. The downside, of course, is cost. There are only 3 registered Van Spee installers in the industrialised West, and their charges reflect the complexity of the work, the difficulty and danger of handling the lethally unstable materials involved, the years of training and hands-on experience, and, of course, their limitless greed. All in all, it would be cheaper to buy a large island and pay the inhabitants handsomely to relocate. The trustees of the Carpenter were able to afford a Van Spee enclave because Zauberwerk AG generously provided the materials and labour at cost. They used the space to store books, at least one copy of every book ever written for or about the profession. Note the word ever. In Van Spee space, the concept of flexi-time takes root and blossoms like an orchid in a hothouse. Sections 9 to 9,999,999,999 are where they store the books that haven't been written yet. It goes without saying that nobody's allowed anywhere near them, at least until real time catches up with them. But, as the trustees put it, it's nice to know they're there. The telephone directories are in section 4, next to gardening. It can take several hours to get at the yellow pages in section 4, depending on whether there's a crane available. As it happened, Mr. Goggarty had once done a substantial favour for one of the crane drivers, so the usual rules didn't apply to him. "Thanks, George," he shouted, as the crane's massive hydraulic arm gently lowered the book into its reinforced steel cradle, disconnected its bearing chains, and slid back along the gleaming rails into its siding. "I can manage from here." Turning those thin, flimsy yellow pages calls for specialised equipment, since each leaf measures 10 metres by 6, and the book is almost as thick as it is wide. Mr. Goggarty clambered into the cab, settled himself in the seat, turned the power on, and started manipulating levers. The letters of the alphabet were helpfully stencilled onto the gate of the main selector panel. He slid the lever up into D for dry cleaners and waited as the huge machine purred smoothly into action. D selected appeared on the LCD panel in front of him. Input search criteria. He typed in Clevedon Road 1900 to 2009 and hit the red starter button. A motorised winch started to wind, ratchets clattered. The process always made him think of raising a drawbridge, with the added complication that the bridge was only 0.04 millimetres thick. He reached in his pocket, found his palm top, and occupied himself usefully for the next 20 minutes going over his recent invoices. A bell sounded to tell him that the search was complete. He looked up. A laser pointer was picking out a spot on the page, raised sill-like in front of him. He climbed out of the cab and into the cherry-picker box mounted on a telescopic arm, which would lift him close enough to read his selected entry. He closed the safety bar behind him and carefully guided the joystick. The box lifted off the ground and up into the air, just as well he didn't suffer from vertigo. 2 minutes to get there. He stopped the box and put the brake on, then leaned forward until his nose was almost touching the point on the page where the red laser spot glowed like a bullet wound. He took out his pocket magnifier and read, "Speedy Clean Dry Cleaners, 77 Clevedon Road." And that was it. No postcode, no date, and, significant omission in context, no phone number. Still, at least he had a name, Speedy Clean. He guided the box back to ground level, hopped back into the cab and engaged the cross-reference drive. There were 1,825 entries for speedy clean in the dry cleaning section. He hit the copy button, which sent a camera drone buzzing away to photograph the relevant entries. Time estimate 6 hours. He glanced at his watch and decided he'd go away and come back again. Progress? Well, maybe.
Cheers, George, he called out. I've left the keys in, okay?
A grunt by way of reply, which was more than he usually got. George must be in a good mood today. He left the annex and walked slowly back along the corridor to the main library. As always, he was sure he felt a slight tremor as he crossed from Van Spee into real space, though that wasn't supposed to happen. Then across the great hall, left and right and into the coffee shop.
A latte, an apple Danish and a fast forward, please, he said to the sad-looking man behind the counter,
who murmured, "Coming right up," and disappeared through the beaded curtain into the back room. He came back about 2 minutes later with the coffee and the Danish and a small white plastic alarm clock.
6 hours, please, Mr. Goggerty said.
The sad man nodded and turned a dial on the back of the clock, then put it on a tray with the rest of Mr. Goggerty's order. "Cash?" he asked. "Or on the tab?"
"The tab, thanks, Mike."
"You're welcome." Mr. Goggerty found a table in the corner, put down the tray, looked around, nobody else in the coffee shop, good, and sat down. Now, fast forwards weren't really his style. A waste, he couldn't help thinking, and human life is so very short. But right now, his impatience was getting the better of his will to live sequentially, and besides, Mr. Horse paid him by the hour. First, though, he drank the coffee and ate half the Danish. Only then did he tap the bright red button on the top of the clock, whose arms immediately started to move. Mr. Goggerty checked his watch. 11:35 a.m. Nobody really knows why they sell the fast-forwards in the coffee shop. The likeliest theory is that it's a quiet, peaceful place with a pleasant, low-stress atmosphere where your body can slump motionless for 6 hours or so while your consciousness skips the tedium and suspense of waiting around. Further, or alternatively, it's perfectly normal to see someone huddle for ages over 1 cup of coffee in a coffee shop. Cynics maintain that the chief librarian doesn't like having fast-forwarders in the reading room because he reckons they make the place look untidy. At 5:35 p.m, Mr. Goggerty sat bolt upright, opened his eyes, blinked twice and reached for the other half of his Danish. Fast-forwarding always left him hungry and with a sour taste in his mouth, like falling asleep on a train. He took his time making his way down to the stack, where a fat manila envelope was sitting waiting for him at the inquiries desk with an invoice laid on top of it like a bride's nightgown on her pillow. He paid by card, his Banco de los Muertos Neutronium card, the highest credit limit in the multiverse, just about covered it, signed the invoice and retired to the clubroom. He liked the clubroom, though not for the reason that made it so hugely popular. It's the duly accredited Victorian embassy, and, just as the French embassy is legally French territory, in the eyes of the law it's firmly situated in 1897, linked to the rest of the building by a Van Spee conduit, which makes it the only public lounge area in London where you can smoke. Mr. Goggerty liked the deep leather armchairs and the oak panelling. He ordered a whisky and soda, paid for it with one of the genuine Victorian shillings he always kept by him for that express purpose, opened his envelope and hooked out a massive wad of printout. He was less than a third of the way through when the bell rang, warning him that the club would be closing in 5 minutes. He scrabbled in his pocket, found his packet of slow-me-downs and took enough for 3 hours. The last thing he needed was a break in his concentration. The special merit of the Carpenter copy of the Yellow Pages is that it lists businesses whether they ask it to or not. Every commercial enterprise conducted in the United Kingdom since 1880, listed with addresses, phone numbers where applicable, names of proprietors and dates. Speedy Clean, it seemed, had been pretty well everywhere over the past 10 years, from Liskeard to Wick. But it never stayed in the same place for more than 48 hours. It had to be the same business, because the proprietors were the same. George and Eileen Williams. Sure enough, they'd been in business at 77 Clevedon Road on the relevant date. After that, they'd gone to Derby. The most recent entry, today in fact, was 108 Commercial Road, Bexhill. He glanced at his watch, then took out his mobile. No reply. Closed for the night, and come morning they could be anywhere. Still, the Yellow Pages would find them, and if he got here bright and early, he'd have a whole day to track them down. He allowed himself a gentle smirk as he crammed the printouts back in the envelope, just as his last slow-me-down wore off and he slid painlessly back into real time. 2 minutes till the bar closed. He ordered another whiskey and soda and knocked it back in one, then left the library, summoned a taxi, and went home. That night, the Paul Carpenter Memorial Library burned to the ground. Oh, wonder why that was then. Why would it burn to the ground? Can you imagine though? Can you imagine like a Yellow Pages that needs a crane to turn the pages? That would, the immensity of it is actually, I can't even imagine it. You know, it's like you see mountains and you see massive buildings, but even then I don't think they would come close to the immensity of that Yellow Pages. I remember the Yellow Pages when it used to like come through your door and it had a polythene wrapper and it used to clunk on the doormat, like, you know, and leave a small sort of like shudder in the equilibrium. Back in the days, before all this googly mooglies and stuffs. But yes, so what's going on? What's going on with this dry cleaners? Why is it skipping backwards and forwards every couple of days? What did they do to deserve this? Is it speedy clean? If it's not speedy at getting your stuff cleaned, maybe it's speedy clean to get your stuff cleaned before they go to the next place. Who knows? Would you like a slow it down? A slow me down? Or would you like a fast forward? Are you just happy with kind of like pootling along just as it is? I don't know which one I would like. Sometimes I guess like a fast forward would be great, like when you're waiting for a flight, or if you're waiting for your appointment in the doctor's office, and slow me down when you're eating a particularly nice piece of quiche. I don't know why I said quiche then, because I never eat quiche, but quiche. I do make a cracking quiche though. You know, crustless and with a crust. Bacon. See, there you go. I've gone off on a tangent again. My mind's gone somewhere else. So, I'm going to have a bit of a break, and then hopefully I will be able to do another chapter a bit later on. As ever, if you could hit the like button, I would very much appreciate it, especially if you've got this far. And if you've got this far, thank you. Thank you, much appreciated. Big loves and hugs and cuddles and stuffs. Yes, so if you could leave a like, hit the notifications bell. I'll keep doing these instant premieres. As you know, I always finish a book in full because that's how I am. So yes, I said the like button, notifications bell if you want to share or subscribe. That is awesome. Every little bit of interaction helps the channel, and I always like to have a little bit of a chat, a little bit of a banter, and a comment always makes me smile. And you always get a like and a heart to leave a comment. But, you know, I do like that little bit of banter because it's just, yeah. It's lovely. It's lovely. Right, hopefully back in a little while. But for now, here we go. And we'll hopefully get another chapter today. Yes. So take it easy. Big loves and cuddles, and rest well and eat good food and smile. Oh, I haven't got a tune for the day. I couldn't remember the Hong Kong Phooey one, so we will go back to we will mend it, we will stick it with this. No, it's not we will mend it, we will stick it. Stick it. We will mend it, we will fix it, we will stick it with scissors and glue. I don't know if that is actually how it goes, but it's how it's committed to my memory. The magical mechanical mouse organ. Hey! Okay, and on that note, I'm off. See you later.